November 1095. The Council of Clermont, France. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd of nobles, knights, and commoners and utters words that will change the world forever. Take up the cross, he commands. Reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels. God wills it. His voice echoes across Christendom like thunder. This isn't just a call to war. It's a summons to salvation itself. Thousands will answer. Tens of thousands will march. Most will never return home. But those who survive will witness horrors and glories that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is the story of the First Crusade, a tale of faith and fury, of impossible odds and unthinkable brutality, of men who walked thousands of miles through hell itself for a glimpse of the holy city. To understand why Europe erupted in religious fury, you must first understand the enemy they faced, the Seljuk Turks. In the 11th century, these nomadic warriors from Central Asia swept into the Islamic world like a whirlwind. They converted to Islam and conquered everything in their path with terrifying efficiency. In 1055, they captured Baghdad. In 1071, at the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert, they shattered the Byzantine Empire's army and threw open the gates to Christian Anatolia. Emperor Alexios I, Komnenos of Constantinople, watched his empire crumble. The Seljuks weren't just taking territory, they were strangling the Byzantine heartland, cutting off pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem and threatening Constantinople itself. Desperate and humiliated, Alexios did something Byzantine emperors rarely did. He begged the West for help. Europe answered, and what an answer it was. One of the largest military forces medieval Europe had ever assembled began to gather. 70,000 men strong, knights in gleaming armor, foot soldiers with dreams of glory, priests promising salvation, and camp followers hoping for plunder. They came from France, from the Holy Roman Empire, from Norman Sicily, from every corner of Christendom. Leading them were some of France's most powerful nobles, men who left behind lands, titles, and comfortable lives for this desperate gamble. Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's own representative. Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Godfrey of Bouillon, a warrior of legendary piety. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman warlord as ambitious as he was ruthless. They weren't marching under a king or emperor. They were a coalition of rivals, barely holding together, united only by faith and the promise of Jerusalem. When the Crusader armies arrived in Constantinople in 1096, Emperor Alexios got his first good look at the force he'd summoned, and immediately regretted it. These weren't disciplined Byzantine troops. These were hungry, unruly Western barbarians who looked at his magnificent city with barely concealed greed. The Crusaders expected Alexios to lead them personally, to shower them with supplies, to join their holy war. Alexios wanted none of it. He had asked for mercenaries to help reclaim Byzantine territory. Instead, he got an uncontrollable mob that might conquer land for themselves rather than return it to him. The standoff was tense. Constantinople's food supplies dwindled as 70,000 unexpected guests devoured everything. Fights broke out between locals and Crusaders. Alexios needed these dangerous allies gone, fast. His solution was brilliant manipulation. He demanded that each Crusader leader swear an oath of fealty to him, promising to return any conquered territory to Byzantine control. In exchange, food, supplies, and transportation across the Bosporus into Asia. One by one, they knelt and swore. Godfrey first, Then, the others. They had little choice. Without Byzantine support, they'd starve in Constantinople. But everyone knew these oaths meant nothing. The moment the Crusaders crossed into Asia, they'd be on their own, pursuing their own ambitions. Alexios rushed them across the Bosporus as quickly as possible, gave them some tactical advice about fighting the Seljuks, and breathed a sigh of relief as they marched away from his capital. The Crusader army crossed into Asia in early 1097. Their first target, Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate and a city that once belonged to Byzantium. On May 14, 1097, the siege began. The Crusaders surrounded the city's massive walls, erected siege engines, and prepared for a long, grinding assault. Sultan Kilij Arslan, ruler of the Seljuks, learned of the siege and was stunned. How had this army gotten so deep into his territory? He gathered his forces and rushed to lift the siege. On May 16th, his cavalry attacked. The battle was savage. Seljuk horse archers circled the Crusader positions, raining down arrows. Turkish cavalry charged again and again, but the Crusaders held firm, their heavy armor absorbing hits that would have killed lighter troops. The battle raged for hours. Then Kilij Arslan saw something that made his blood run cold. The Crusader force was far, far larger than his scouts had reported. He was outnumbered. The casualties were mounting. His men began to waver. The Sultan made the brutal calculation. He couldn't win this fight. He withdrew, leaving Nicaea to its fate. The siege dragged on for another month. Finally, on June 18th, the Turkish garrison surrendered. But there was a catch. Alexios had secretly negotiated the surrender, taking control of the city before the Crusaders could loot it. The Franks were furious. They'd fought and bled for this city, and now they were forbidden from plundering it. Only Alexios's generous financial rewards prevented a full rebellion. The Crusaders pocketed their gold, but the bitterness lingered. They would remember this betrayal. At the end of June, the Crusader army marched deeper into Anatolia, accompanied by some Byzantine troops under Tatikios. They split into two groups for easier logistics, the Normans under Bohemond marching ahead, the French following behind. The plan was to reunite at Dorylaeum. They never got the chance. On July 1st, Kilij Arslan struck back. His cavalry ambushed the Norman contingent, catching them strung out on the march. The Normans scrambled into a desperate defensive formation, circling their wagons, equipment, and non-combatants. Horsemen with axes, lances, and swords formed a bristling perimeter, while Bohemond sent frantic messengers racing to find the French. Kilij Arslan's horse archers began their deadly work. They circled the Crusader position, loosing arrow after arrow from a distance, never getting close enough for the heavily armored knights to countercharge. It was death from 1,000 cuts. Horses screamed and collapsed. Men fell with arrows in their necks, their arms, their legs. The Normans held, but barely. Every minute felt like an hour. Every hour brought them closer to annihilation. Then, like salvation itself, the French arrived. The Turks, who had expected to destroy the isolated Normans, suddenly faced the entire Crusader army. The trap had become a battle they couldn't win. Rather than face the combined Christian force, Kilij Arslan ordered a retreat. His cavalry melted away into the Anatolian hills. The Crusaders had survived, but barely. From that point on, the Crusaders faced no organized resistance as they marched through Anatolia. But what they encountered was almost worse than battle: deliberate devastation. Kilij Arslan had employed a scorched earth strategy. Every village burned, every well poisoned, every field stripped bare. The Seljuks left nothing behind that could sustain an army. It was the middle of summer. The sun beat down mercilessly on men wearing chainmail and carrying heavy packs. Water sources were days apart. Food was scarce. The Crusaders looted and pillaged any settlement they found. But there was little to take. Men began to die, not in glorious battle, but from thirst, starvation, and heat exhaustion. Horses collapsed and were butchered for meat. Morale crumbled. The various noble leaders bickered constantly over leadership, but none were strong enough to seize full command. Through this nightmare, the Crusaders marched, driven by faith, by desperation, by the promise of Jerusalem. Step by agonizing step, they drew closer to their next great trial. On October 20th, 1097, the Crusader army arrived at Antioch, a massive fortress city midway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. One look at the city's defenses, and hearts sank. Antioch was enormous, so large that the Crusader army couldn't fully surround it. Its walls were thick and heavily fortified. The gates were impregnable. Taking this city by assault seemed impossible. So began one of the most grueling sieges in medieval history. Winter came. The partial blockade meant supplies could still trickle into Antioch, but the Crusaders starved. By January, hundreds, perhaps thousands, had died of starvation. Men ate grass. They ate their horses. They ate leather. In March, a small English fleet arrived with supplies. Foraging improved. The Crusaders survived, but barely. Meanwhile, the Seljuk commander Kaboga was assembling a massive relief army from Syria, Iraq, and Anatolia. Time was running out. Bohemond of Taranto saw his opportunity. He convinced the other leaders that if he could take Antioch, he would keep it for himself. More importantly, he'd found a traitor, an Armenian commander named Firuz, who controlled a section of the city's walls. On June 2nd, 1098, in the dead of night, Firuz allowed Bohemond and a small force to climb the walls and open a gate. Horns sounded. The Crusaders poured in. The sack of Antioch was a nightmare of blood and chaos. Most of the Muslim inhabitants were slaughtered. Christians, Greeks, Syrians, Armenians were killed in the confusion as well. The city ran red. But the Crusaders' triumph lasted less than a month. Kaboga's 40,000-strong army arrived and surrounded Antioch. The hunters had become the hunted. For 4 days, starting June 10th, waves of Muslim soldiers attacked the city walls from dawn until dusk. The Crusaders, depleted and exhausted from their own siege, barely held them off. When frontal assaults failed, Kaboga changed tactics: starvation. The same weapon the Crusaders had used was now turned against them. Inside Antioch, morale collapsed. Defeat seemed inevitable. The Crusaders sought terms of surrender. Kaboga refused. On June 28, 1098, facing annihilation, the Crusaders made a desperate choice. They would sally out and fight. At dawn, the gates opened. The Franks marched out in 4 battle groups to face an army that outnumbered them. What happened next shocked everyone. The Muslim army, expecting the Crusaders to cower behind walls, wasn't prepared for this suicidal aggression. Their disciplined formation broke. A disorderly counterattack was launched and failed. With minimal casualties, the Crusaders routed Kaboga's massive army. The Muslims broke and fled. It was a miracle, and the Crusaders knew it. But victory at Antioch brought new problems. Bohemond claimed the city as his own. The other leaders objected. The crusade ground to a halt as nobles argued. A plague broke out, killing more soldiers. Horses died by the dozens. Muslim peasants refused to sell food to the Crusaders. The minor knights and common soldiers grew restless, threatening to march on Jerusalem without their bickering lords. Finally, in early 1099, the march resumed, leaving Bohemond behind as the first Prince of Antioch. The army moved down the Mediterranean coast, encountering little resistance. Local Muslim rulers chose peace over war, supplying the Crusaders rather than fighting them. The army swelled as more contingents joined. On June 7, 1099, the Crusaders finally saw what they had marched so far to reach: Jerusalem. Many wept. But Jerusalem offered no welcome. The Fatimids had recently retaken the city from the Seljuks and expelled all Christian inhabitants. The governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, prepared for siege. The Crusader army that arrived was a shadow of what had left Europe. Perhaps 12,000 men remained, including only 1,500 cavalry. There was no time for a prolonged blockade. The arid countryside provided no food or water. A Fatimid relief army was already marching from Egypt. They had one choice: assault the city directly. On June 13th, the first assault began. It failed. The Crusaders were divided and disorganized. Some leaders didn't even participate. Those who reached the walls with ladders were cut down. The survivors retreated in defeat. A council was called. They needed siege engines. On June 17th, Genoese sailors arrived with timber and skilled engineers. The Crusaders built towers, rams, and catapults. On July 13th, as news reached them of the approaching Fatimid army, the final assault began. Raymond's forces attacked the south gate. Godfrey and Tancred attacked the north wall. The Crusaders rolled their siege towers against the walls and began to scale them. The northern assault succeeded. The Crusaders breached the walls. Panic spread among the defenders. The walls were abandoned. The Crusaders poured into Jerusalem. What followed was one of the most infamous massacres in medieval history. The Crusaders stormed through the city, killing indiscriminately. Muslims were slaughtered in the streets, in their homes, in the mosques. Jewish residents who had taken refuge in their synagogue were burned alive when the Crusaders set fire to the building. The defenders who fled to the Temple Mount made their last stand there. Tancred and his men cut them down. Blood ran through the streets. Contemporary accounts, likely exaggerated, claimed it reached the horses' bridles. Even allowing for medieval hyperbole, the slaughter was extensive and brutal. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the garrison commander, negotiated with Raymond, surrendering the citadel in exchange for safe passage. He was one of the few Muslims who survived. Jerusalem had fallen. The First Crusade was complete. On July 22nd, a council elected Godfrey of Bouillon as the ruler of Jerusalem, though he refused the title king, instead taking defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Most Crusaders, considering their pilgrimage complete, immediately went home. Only 300 knights and 2,000 infantry stayed to defend the city. Those who had left Europe but never reached Jerusalem, and there were many, were mocked, scorned, and threatened with excommunication. Those who had survived to see the Holy City returned as heroes. The First Crusade's success sent shockwaves through both the Christian and Islamic worlds. It established Crusader states in the Levant that would last for nearly 2 centuries. It launched a series of religious wars that would continue for generations. It deepened the divide between Christianity and Islam. It reinforced European identity around the concept of Christendom, and it proved that faith, when weaponized, could move mountains, or in this case, march armies across continents to conquer cities in the name of God. The Crusades had begun, and the world would never be the same.